Welcome back, everybody, to the School Leadership Show. With me, as always, co-host Jen David Lang. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Mike. Good to be here.
Great to be here with you, too. So we have a really interesting book to talk about today, and I'm excited to talk about it in our current context. It's called Street Data, a next generation model for equity, pedagogy, and school transformation by Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan. And we're really going to kind of take this from the perspective of school transformation, right? That's our plan today.
Sounds great.
Yeah, and this is kind of falls into the category, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic and so many things are different, that this, we file this under the category of never let a good crisis go to waste. So here's our opportunity to talk about school transformation with a bit of an equity bent, but then moving into changes in pedagogy and changes in adult culture. So that's sort of our roadmap for today. How's that sound, Jen?
Yeah, I mean, it really is an opportunity for leaders and teachers to reimagine how we do school. I think the pandemic kind of broke open the mold and made us realize that the way we do school doesn't work for everyone, doesn't work for a lot of people. And so, my understanding is that this book is about school change. How do we make schools more equitable? And really, how do we make them more effective? And so now is the time, it's June as we're recording this. We're going into the summer where we know school leaders have a little bit of time and space to rethink how we do schools. And these two authors provide a lot of guidance in how do we go about creating more equitable schools.
So the title, I think, is a little bit provocative, right? So street data, what is street data? Why should we care about it?
Okay. So, one of the things they claim is that we rely too much on quote unquote big data, right? So the results of standardized test scores. And what that big data does is it just shows how, groups of students have failed to perform, and it puts forth kind of a false construct of an achievement gap in which the students of color primarily are always seen as having deficits. But that big level data really doesn't tell us a lot and doesn't tell the whole picture. So I think that Shane introduced this in her first book that we also have a podcast on, The Listening Leader, the idea of different types of data, different levels of data. And there is, that larger big data, which she calls satellite data, when you look at large patterns of achievement, usually from standardized tests. Then you can get a little more granular with what she calls map data. And those are like the tests that teachers give, the quizzes, the F&P levels. So they give you more information about skill acquisition, but it's still not as granular as possible. And so she introduced the idea of street data in The Listening Leader, her first book, and then she elaborates on it here. And it's really the qualitative data that lets us better understand the lives of students, staff, families, and particularly the voices of those who have been marginalized in the past, right? The students who are failing, immigrant students, LGBTQ students, staff of color. And so the idea, and we'll get more into this in a moment, is to really go out and listen to the people who are most impacted by the changes you're going to make in your school, but who historically have not been listened to.
So let's get into that. So, if school leaders were going to kind of take this approach and, move away, well, I don't think we're ever going to get to actually move away from big data because it's still the stick that we get hit with. But if school leaders wanted to get more into street data, and I think back to my graduate work and ethnographies and grounded theory and things like that, where you really are looking at the qualitative data without a preconceived notion or hypothesis, but looking to see what emerges from the data. Like, can you want to talk more about that?
Yeah.
And how what some of the different parts are, or ideas that they bring
Yeah.
up.
Well, first of all, part of it is redefining school, and right. If school is just how you're doing in math and science, that's it. Right. But we really want to create schools where students thrive, where their social emotional well-being is intact, where there's a sense of efficacy. Right. There's a lot of things that we don't measure in schools. So if we start to use street data to measure those things, then our teachers and our leaders will pay more attention to those things, right? What gets measured is what matters, is what people say. So the idea is that we can use street data to find out, which students have a stronger sense of purpose or efficacy, right? We could reach out to families and hear from them. How do you think students learn best, right? We can do exit interviews when students leave and find out, what is it about the school that made you leave, particularly with an anti-racist lens. You could observe student-teacher interactions and really look for, the positive feedback, the negative feedback. So those are the kinds of things you can get at with street data, and they give very concrete suggestions for how to gather it. And I love these suggestions. So, for example, you can do any type of interview, survey, focus group, any type of listening campaigns, right? In small groups, large groups. You can use online surveys, Google Forms. You can do equity observations. You go into classrooms specifically to track, who's responding. You can observe class staff meetings also to see, which staff members are responding, the veterans, the new ones, the white teachers, who is speaking more. You can examine, class categories. So what percentage of white students versus students of color are in your remedial, your honors, or your career tech tracks? You could do home visits. That's a great way to gather street data.
Can I go back? Can I go back to the?
Go ahead. Sorry.
That's great. I want to go back to the equity observations, because there are, I think, over the last couple of years, different. There are out there in the ether. I know different folks have put them out there, but different rubrics or sort of lists of look-fors when it comes to observing with an equity eye, looking at the environment, looking at, what's on the walls, what's the student work look like, what are the materials that are available, things like that. So I think, that's another kind of concrete, way to, make it a little more objective, I guess, if you have sort of that rubric that you're going in. But, So talk more about home visits, because I think that's something that, certainly in my experience as a principal, I don't know that maybe 1 or 2 home visits in like 10 years. But
we hear more about those, like for students entering school, right? Like pre-K or kindergarten. Obviously takes time. Obviously you need permission, but even just doing a few of them can help you to have a deeper understanding, or what are the life experiences of our students at this school, right? Or have a student take you walk around the community, especially if you don't live there. I think it's just really the idea of broadening our idea of what data is. Think about how far a home visit is from looking at, the standardized state test results for 8th grade math, right? It's really far from that. And the next suggestion they give is to do shadowing. I think, it's late in the year, it's June, but if our school leaders all shadowed one student, I bet it would completely change their view. You get permission from a student, show up at their bus stop, and really spend a day in their shoes. Go to all their classes, sit where they sit at lunch, what they do for recess. It's eye-opening. I shadowed my daughter during virtual school all day, and I learned a ton from that one day. So I love the idea of shadowing, and then obviously going over what you see.
And also too, with shadowing, I think that can be powerful, not just in your own context. So I was an elementary school principal, but there was a time when I shadowed a middle school student and a high school student. Brilliant. to see kind of, where they're headed, because high school and middle school were a long time ago for me.
Yeah.
And, it's different now. And I think even the other way, if somebody's a middle school principal taking a look at, what's a day in the life of an elementary school kid look like versus a high school kid, and kind of how that where you and your community and school fit into the larger context, I think is a nice byproduct of that.
I think it's brilliant. And there's a lot of these really concrete suggestions and ideas that they give in the book. These are different ways to gather street data that you wouldn't even think of. I mean, another suggestion they give is to do instructional rounds, which we've all heard of, but get this, invite students as young as third grade in to do instructional rounds. I don't know any principal who has done that, but the idea of like, with a team, dipping into a classroom, explaining both to the teacher and the students, this is not evaluative, of course, and stepping out. And your lens as the school leader, but what about that fifth grade student? What did they see? Like, think about what you could learn through their eyes. I don't know. What do you think of that, Mike?
I think I read that one and I thought, that's wild. I would love to do that because you can. I remember having conversations with students and about pedagogy, but it was in their words, but they would tell you, what good teaching was. They know.
They know. And they're not going to come out of the classroom and say there was no aim posted on the board. Right? You know what I mean? It's going to be very refreshing what they see and real because the whole purpose of teaching is it's for them. So anyway, so they have really great ideas about different ways to gather this street data that anyone listening could use, today, tomorrow, and the next day.
But then what do you do with it? I guess that's sort of, okay, great. We're awash in data, but how do we change it into information and insight? Like what are their suggestions for that?
So they put forth a new process for change transformation that makes a lot of sense to me. Now, this may rub people the wrong way, people who have been following the plan, do, study, act way of approaching school change. And you don't have to throw it out, but if you think about it, the plan is when you develop a change idea, right? You test it out, you collect data, and then you evaluate if it worked. That seems to make sense, but think about it. Wait a minute. You're going to do number one, develop a change idea before you've gathered any data. In some ways, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So they propose a new way to approach change that is a much more equitable approach. They propose a listen, uncover, reimagine, move approach to school transformation. Listen, uncover, reimagine, move. So the first stage is listen, and that is the listening campaigns, the shadowing, the gathering of the school data, and particularly seeking out those voices that have been marginalized and that we haven't heard from in the past. So all these suggestions that we just talked about for gathering school data, that's the first step, is first you're going to gather that data. And then the next step is to uncover the themes, like what did you hear? I had this brilliant professor in college who said, okay, in high school, whenever you wrote papers, you came up with a thesis and then you looked for evidence. No. Now we're in college, he said, you're going to first look at the evidence and then come up with a thesis. And that's what she's saying here. So after meeting with all of these groups, then you're going to look for what are the themes and the root causes that emerge. And
then some of the tools in there, they offer up a couple of protocols, right? That folks can use.
Some of these are not theirs, like the peeling the onion and iceberg. I have hyperlinks in my book summary of these. Those are protocols, but they did create a street data analysis protocol. I have a streamlined version that you can also link to. And so it really gives you like a step-by-step approach for how you might take all these focus groups, these observations, shadowing, instructional route, and how you might come to some larger themes or challenges that you want to address. And then I really like the way they call it. The third step is reimagine, right? Like we said, this is a ripe time to reimagine school. And the idea is to get creative and to include the students, the parents, the paraprofessionals, include the people that you were talking to and surveying, right? So that we're not looking for a solution for people, for students, for staff, for the community. We're looking for a solution with them. So we bring them into the dialogue to try to reimagine and to bring their voices in and to come up with a plan. And she says, don't be fooled. Like you think, I can't include this group or that group. What do they know about school change? She gives an example of even kindergartners, right? Wiggly little kindergartners can be brought in to discuss how things might be different. They can help reimagine. And then the final step is to move, to actually create a plan and to try to make some changes. And it's cyclical, it's not linear, but that's the idea, is that our first step is the listening. And then the plan is at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. This is like confession time here,
Yeah.
or therapy time for me. Because I think this model is refreshing, because I've always been a big fan of, kind of ethnography and grounded theory, and going where the data takes you. But I remember as a principal, when it came time to do the exercise in compliance that was the yearly school improvement plan, I would just sit in my office and write it, and then take it to the committee and be like, what do you think? And they didn't want to deal with it. So they'd be like, it looks great. Okay. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that out loud, but at the same time, people change and the landscape changes. But this makes so much.
Yeah, and that's what everybody did. And what I want to caution people, because it is June, right? And often leaders don't have a chance to breathe until the summer, right? So if you want to, if you believe in this type of approach where you're first getting information from the people most impacted by the changes, you still can do that over the summer, right? You still can reach out to some students and staff. You still can send a survey home. You still can do some home visits. So even though the summer is like, great, I'm going to make a lot of changes and spring them on everybody in, late August, September, you really should consider trying this approach and finding people that you can gather some of that street data from.
So I want to back up a little bit, because the authors do put this whole process squarely in the context of equity. And they note several equity traps and tropes that I thought were particularly compelling, because, equity is everywhere, and as it should be. Like, it should be a foundational principle of our work. But at the same time, I feel like there are some people out there that when they hear the word equity, they roll their eyes, because it's like everywhere all the time. Are we ever going to talk about anything but equity? Well, and my answer to that would be, well, until we have equity, we're going to be talking about it. But anyway, what you want to talk?
Answer, Mike. Good answer. Yeah.
You want to talk about those equity traps and tropes? Yeah. I just thought they were fascinating.
Yeah. Well, first I want to point out this chapter was written by Jamila Dugan, and she also has an Ed Leadership article just about these equity traps and tropes. And she describes 10 of them. I'll just pick 3 for brevity, but these are brilliant. So these are all the ways that we're not fully implementing equity. So the first one she calls doing equity, right? So you treat equity like a series of tools and strategies and tasks, right? Without really understanding that it's a whole person, whole system change, right? It's a real adaptive change. It's not a technical change that we can just change a few strategies and tools, right? We've got to think about culture, identity, healing. It's a much bigger practice. So we fall into the trap of doing equity. And I did air quotes for listeners who don't see that. She also talks about another track, which is the equity warrior, right? So, you have the person on staff, like this person is the one who is, responsible for the vision and the implementation. Like, that's the equity warrior, right? As opposed to, us and we, it's them.
So that one I think is spectacular, because I watch systems around me, hire their chief equity officer or their director of equity or whatever. And that makes me nervous, because it's kind of like, oh, well, okay, well, equity's this person's job. It's like special ed. We have a special ed director.
I don't have to do
now,
it, right?
I don't have to do. I have to think about special ed now, because we got a director that does that. Right. So I think that's a great one to bring.
Yeah. And I'll share one more. The spray and pray equity approach. I like that. I imagine spray and pray equity approach. So that's the idea that, like, you have some expert come in, right? You decide, okay, we're going to dedicate resources to this. You get some fancy consultant to come in for a half day, but there's no long-term plan, right? So you spray it and then you pray it's going to stick, right? You throw it against the wall. And, certainly it's great to bring in outsiders with expertise, but you really need a team to follow through. So these traps and tropes, it can be a wonderful discussion to have among your leadership team to see, first to admit, are we falling into any of these traps and tropes before, considering a transformation process like the one that we described, the listen, uncover, reimagine, move.
So in this context of equity and thinking about street data and then that, revised approach to school improvement of listen, uncover, reimagine, move, how do the authors contend that this will change pedagogy and change adult culture? Because at the end of the day, I'm sorry, but while we like to believe that education is about kids, at the end of the day, sometimes it does feel like it's all about the adults. So how do we make sure? How does this help change that adult culture in a positive way?
Well, let me first say they wrote in the book that equity work is primarily pedagogical. Equity work is primarily pedagogical. So you have to change pedagogy. And they say what we want to do to move toward equity is to change from a pedagogy of compliance to a pedagogy of voice, right? What compliance? We often still have students sitting there listening as we, the teachers, the experts, drop knowledge on them, right? They sit in rows, they fill in bubble sheets for tests. But we need to develop more of a pedagogy of voice, right? Where students are also seen as the sources of knowledge and ideas and are part of a learning community. And so they give a couple of examples of how to do this. They suggest you create a graduate profile and you think about when our students are graduating from elementary, middle, high school, wherever you are, what kinds of skills do we want them to have, right? Do we want them to think critically? Do we want them to practice digital citizenship, manage their time? So, let's really think about the deep skills we want students to learn. And then they have just a couple of even small guidelines. I feel like if you even just put these guidelines up and discuss them in a staff meeting, you want to value questions over answers, right? You want to develop a culture of inquiry and thought. You want to ritualize reflection, give students time to think and reflect. You want to elevate performance-based assessment, right? If we're moving away from, big data is the only way that we know anything about students, right? What about really elevating performance-based assessments, portfolios, letting students really demonstrate their knowledge? We want to make learning public, right? It's often like students alone with their thoughts and their learning in their head, right? But what if we have ways for them to present not just to you as the teacher, but to the wider community? Can they show their knowledge, share their knowledge? You want to prioritize feedback over grades. That's a whole other podcast. We won't go into that. But yeah, you really want a non-hierarchical democratic community. Students are sitting in, circles, not rows, and co-creating knowledge together. So these are some of the things that will help to create a pedagogy of voice instead of compliance.
And this is why I love education, because that whole list that you just rattled off and described, there is nothing new on there.
Yeah.
That is all what we know to be good practice. Yeah. And I Absolutely. Like how they're anchoring
and that we should measure those things. Right? Yeah. And then, they make the really important point that what we want for the students, we have to also provide for the teachers, right? In schools where teachers have voice, you're more likely to have students who have voice. In schools where teachers have agency, then you're more likely to have students who have agency. If you have schools where teachers feel vulnerable and can make mistakes and learn from them, you're more likely to have students who feel they can be vulnerable and make mistakes. So they say there's a very close link between this pedagogy of voice and creating an adult culture that allows for those things, for that vulnerability, for that voice, for that agency, right? So we said, we want learning for students to be public. Why can't we create a culture where learning for the adults is public too, right? Where teachers get to share, these are the challenges I'm having and the problems that I'm having, and we support them in brainstorming and coming up with suggestions. And then go even further as the leader, right? Can you demonstrate your own vulnerability, right? This is what I'm reading. This is what I'm learning. I don't know all the answers. I'm not going to drop all my knowledge, right? We all have different knowledge to share. So we have to change that adult culture as well as changing the student culture. And go ahead, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, and this is one of those things where I feel like, again, once I feel like the culture comes along easier when teachers and administrators see that the changes they have made are effective.
Yeah.
So to see those strategies, to see, that, the use of data result in something different than they've gotten before, I think helps build that culture. Cause you don't stand up in the staff meeting and say, okay, we just had our guest speaker on equity, we're all good.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you need some small wins. You need to have some changes occur. And I think, given these last 2 years, I think teachers will find it a breath of fresh air if you say we're not just focusing on student pedagogy, but we're also focusing on the adult culture. They talk a lot. There's a lot of echoes of Brene Brown here. They talk about, the shame culture, right? The bulletin board culture, the schools where the bulletin boards have to be perfect, and teachers, when they do share, they share their best practices, and doors are closed and people don't visit each other. And nobody wants that. That's not real. And so they talk about changing that shame culture, which is particularly devastating for teachers of color, right? The perfectionist culture just does not work. And so they have about 4 or 5 questions to ask. Does your school have a shame culture? I'll ask them quickly here. You can do your own little self-assessment. So 1, is perfection the standard? 2, does either or thinking prevail, right? Either something's good or it's bad, right? Oversimplifying. 3, do those at the top hoard power? And 4, is defensiveness the default response to critique? Right? What is it like in our school with feedback? Is it to be defensive or to say, oh, that's interesting? I got to think about that and dive more into it. So they really talk about changing this shame culture so to allow for more vulnerability, making mistakes, as a way to put teachers in a position to provide a more equitable approach to their own students.
I love it. The book is Street Data, a next generation model for equity, pedagogy, and school transformation by Shane Saphir and Jamila Dugan. Jen David Lang, thanks again for another fabulous conversation. If folks want a copy of the summary, can they email you for that?
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Have a good day. Take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.